Even after issuing his very first presidential pardon, President Trump clearly does not know that the acceptance of a pardon is an admission of guilt. So by issuing a pardon on Friday night to former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, President Trump got Joe Arpaio to confess his guilt by accepting that pardon. 102 years ago, the United States Supreme Court said that a pardon, quote, carries an imputation of guilt and acceptance of a confession of it. So one thing that you don't hear from presidents who issue pardons is that the person pardoned did nothing wrong, because the person pardoned has just admitted guilt. But that's what President Trump seems to want us to believe about Joe Arpaio. In a brief press conference with the president of Finland today, President Trump offered a childish defense of his pardon of Joe Arpaio. The president didn't actually defend his pardon as much as he attacked what he said were the bad pardons issued by previous presidents, including some cases that were not pardons at all, but simply clemencies and reductions of sentences. But defending your actions by saying other people have done the same thing is not actually a defense of your actions, as you will discover the next time you're pulled over for driving through a stop sign, if you try that defense. And so the president criticized President Obama's granting of clemency to Chelsea Manning after Chelsea Manning had served 7 years in prison and had more years remaining on that sentence. The president specifically avoided any mention of President George W. Bush commuting the sentence of Scooter Libby, the aide to Vice President Cheney, who was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice. President Bush deliberately refused to actually pardon Scooter Libby because he did not want to eliminate the finding of guilt against Libby, but he did want to eliminate the prison sentence. Now, why didn't President Trump mention President Bush's pardon of Scooter Libby on his list of bad presidential pardons issued by previous presidents? What could be more unpardonable than a president pardoning a member of his own administration? Well, first of all, as I said, President Bush did not actually pardon Scooter Libby. He simply eliminated Libby's prison sentence, which was only a 30-month prison sentence. But President Bush did not eliminate the $250,000 in fines that was part of Libby's sentence, and President Bush did not eliminate Libby's obligation to report to her probation officer for 2 years. And perhaps most importantly, President Bush allowed the legal process to come to a conclusion in the Libby case, including sentencing before the president took action. President Trump did something none of the presidents he mentioned today had done. He stepped into a case between conviction and sentencing and did not allow the case to come to a conclusion. So there might be a lot of reasons why President Trump did not mention President Bush commuting Scooter Libby's sentence today. Trump didn't want to attack a Republican. That's one reason. He obviously enjoyed attacking Presidents Obama and President Clinton. But President Trump does attack Republicans whenever he feels like it. And he certainly has attacked Republicans named Bush viciously. It seems the really big reason Donald Trump left George W. Bush and Scooter Libby out of his list of bad pardons and clemencies issued by previous presidents is that President Trump is saving that one. President Trump is saving the case of Scooter Libby for when he needs it, for when he pardons someone in his administration. If and when President Trump pardons members of his administration, including members of his family, that's when you're going to hear him talk about Scooter Libby. That's when you're going to hear him talk about the president pardoning a member of his administration. And Donald Trump will call it a pardon, what George W. Bush did, even though George W. Bush did not actually pardon Scooter Libby. Listen to what President Trump said today about President Obama commuting, not pardoning, Chelsea Manning.
President Obama commuted the sentence of Chelsea Manning, who leaked countless sensitive and classified documents to WikiLeaks, perhaps and others, but horrible, horrible thing that he did, commuted the sentence, and perhaps pardoned.
commuted the sentence, and then he looks up from his written script and says, perhaps pardoned. No, 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 not perhaps pardoned. There was no pardon. President Obama did not pardon Chelsea Manning. But Donald Trump will say whatever he feels like saying if and when he pardons Mike Flynn or Paul Manafort or Jared Kushner or Donald Trump Jr. or Ivanka Trump. And one of the things he's absolutely going to say is that President Bush pardoned Scooter Libby. He's going to say that even though it's not true. The president provided no facts whatsoever to back up his pardon of Joe Arpaio. No facts, just adjectives. He simply said this.
Sheriff Joe is a patriot. Sheriff Joe loves our country. Sheriff Joe protected our borders. And Sheriff Joe was very unfairly treated by the Obama administration.
Okay, not just adjectives, but you know what I mean. No facts. President Joe Arpaio, called Sheriff Joe by President Trump. He's not a sheriff. He's a former sheriff who was defeated in his last re-election campaign. Joe Arpaio was not convicted by the Obama administration. Joe Arpaio was convicted by the Trump administration. Federal prosecutors working under Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, prosecuted the case against Arpaio, which is why President Trump tried to get Jeff Sessions to drop the case against Joe Arpaio. The Washington Post reports the president asked Attorney General Jeff Sessions whether it would be possible for the government to drop the criminal case against Arpaio, but was advised that would be inappropriate. And listen to this sourcing. According to 3 people with knowledge of the conversation. So let me guess, 3 people with knowledge of a conversation between the president and the attorney general. Well, it's a good thing that the president has never done anything or said anything to alienate Attorney General Jeff Sessions, so we know the leak couldn't possibly have come from Jeff Sessions' side of that conversation. It's worth noting that the Trump White House remains the leakiest White House in history, even with former General John Kelly as the new chief of staff, who was supposed to, among other things, stop the leaking. Todd Gilman, the Washington bureau chief of the Dallas Morning News, got the first question at the press conference today, and he went straight to recovery funding for Texas after the devastation of Hurricane Harvey.
You've also threatened a government shutdown potentially next month over border wall funding. Are these going to hamper long-term, the funding that will be needed long-term for recovery?
No, Todd. I think that you're going to see very rapid action from Congress, certainly from the president, and you're going to get your funding.
Does this situation make you reconsider the possibility of a government shutdown next
I think
month?
it has nothing to do with it, really. I think this is separate. This is going to go really very, very quickly. Again, I've spoken to many of the people we're talking about, and everybody feels the same way I do.
Funding for hurricane recovery has everything to do with a government shutdown. It has everything to do with everything. Paul Ryan and other Republicans already said they weren't going to have a government shutdown over Donald Trump's border wall. And now a government shutdown would mean instantly cutting off aid to those people in Texas who the president claims to sympathize with. The possibility of a government shutdown now is less than zero. The president's staff will be explaining that to him if they haven't already, and the funding for hurricane recovery probably will not go very quickly or very smoothly. Most of the Texas congressional delegation, including both Texas Republican senators, voted against aid for the victims of Hurricane Sandy. They did that for 2 reasons. First, they are Republicans. And second, the victims were not in Texas. The victims of Hurricane Sandy were primarily in New Jersey and New York, and now the congressional delegation that voted against aid for the victims of Hurricane Sandy will be asking Congress for, what, $70 billion, $100 billion more for the victims of Hurricane Harvey? Paul Ryan knows that he needs to round up votes to raise the debt ceiling and to pass a budget, and so Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell might just decide to put all of those things together in one bill, which means it won't be quick, and a new budget for all of the government departments, a raise in the debt ceiling, and special funding for hurricane Harvey relief, all of that in one piece of legislation. If Ryan and McConnell put all those things together in one bill, then senators like Ted Cruz would be forced to vote for that bill to get the Hurricane Harvey relief money that they want. Otherwise, it might be impossible to get senators like Ted Cruz to vote for an increase in the debt ceiling or to vote for the budget bill that the Republicans are going to have to pass and that they're going to have to develop in a compromise with Democrats. Now that the president can no longer threaten a government shutdown to pay for his wall, he is, in effect, writing a new chant for his supporters to use at his next rally.
Is your plan still to have Mexico pay for the wall?
Yes, it will. One way or the other, Mexico is going to pay for the wall. That's right. It
sir-
may be through reimbursement, but one way or the other, Mexico will pay for the wall.
And so at the next Trump rally, I suppose we'll be hearing something like, and who's going to pay for the wall? Whereupon the audience will shout back, Mexico will reimburse us for the wall.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.